Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker, Alysa Grude, Nutrition Specialist with ACDI VOCA.
Good afternoon, my name is Alysa Grude, and I'm a Nutrition Specialist with ACDI VOCA. So today I'm going to be talking about increasing the productivity and linkages among smallholder dairy producers in rural Bangladesh, and the effect that this has on total amount of milk set aside for home consumption versus for sale. So a little bit about Bangladesh for nutrition. We still see that stunting, wasting, anemia are all high. For livestock, which is specific for this presentation, households that have dairy producing cows or do beef fattening have an average of 1.7 heads of cattle per household. And our dairy producing households produce about 1.5 to 3 liters of milk per day. And just generally the adoption of good animal husbandry practices is low, which affects the productivity. So I'm going to be specifically talking about some results from the Livestock Production for Improved Nutrition project. And this is a USAID Feed the Future funded project in rural Bangladesh. And the ultimate goal of the project is to increase or improve food security, nutrition outcomes, and income among smallholder dairy and cattle producers. So the project has been implemented since 2016 in these districts up here. It's been in 6 districts, and we recently added Cox's Bazar at the end of 2018. So for the purpose of this data, I'm not going to be talking about Cox's Bazar. So a little bit about the model the project uses. We work through livestock service providers who are self-employed and are the ones that are selling their services and different products to smallholder producers. They're the ones that receive training from the project and then also cascade this to the households. The households also receive training on nutrition and hygiene. So ultimately, with increased productivity, these households are either selling or setting aside for home consumption. And mostly we're seeing the setting aside home consumption for the milk and not the whole cow that they've been working on for fattening. So briefly, just some of the livestock achievements. I'm going to focus on milk as that's the focus of this presentation. We've seen milk productivity increase by 49% since baseline, and this is even greater when households have adopted 2 or 3 improved animal husbandry practices, and this could be deworming, curative, preventative health, using concentrated feed, etc. So for nutrition, for milk consumption, we've seen the percent of households that are regularly consuming milk, which we classify as daily, has gone up from 29% to 66% since baseline. So with seeing this increased productivity and seeing the frequency of consumption increase, we wanted to look a little bit more at the milk collectors. So the milk collectors are the ones that are going from household to household in these rural areas and collecting milk and then selling elsewhere. They are also self-employed and private sector. So a typical milk collector serves about 29 households, and from a household in a month, they'll collect about 67.4 liters of milk. And 96.4% of these milk collectors have seen an increase in their income since the beginning of project, which are for 2 important reasons, among others, but 2 important for this presentation, is that there are a greater number of households that they're able to collect from now, and they're also receiving an increased quantity from these households. So the milk collectors are selling to neighbors, they're selling to the local market, sweet shops, and chilling centers. And those of you familiar with Bangladesh would probably not be surprised about the percent going to sweet shops. So what we wanted to look at for the linkages and seeing if there's any change in amount set aside for home consumption or sale, we actually use annual survey data. So that comes with all the caveats that a cross-sectional and a study that does not have a control does, right? So we looked at 294 households, and we also looked at some of the private sector interviews we did with the milk collectors. So some of the findings we found were that milk production under 1 liter a day was associated with an increased likelihood that milk was set aside for home consumption. And really, an increase in 1 liter of milk was associated with a decrease by 13.5% in the milk set aside for home consumption. So we've seen productivity increase, we've seen frequency of consumption increase, but why aren't we seeing that affinity for greater consumption and quantity, right? And I think this comes back to the point about the milk collectors, right? Where they would prefer to go to a smaller number of households and get a greater quantity of milk rather than going to multiple households or many households and only collecting 1 liter, 1.5 liter. So these households with their increased productivity now have what we call as milk capital to be able to engage with this milk collector. So this has some implications for nutrition and income, both positive and negative depending which way you look at it. But one important thing for this kind of being a nutrition project is that only 5.3% of households are setting aside an average of 1 liter of milk a day or more. So clearly that quantity just isn't where we need it to be. So on this plot, you can see we have production on the y-axis and consumption on the x-axis, and we have the spots are coded by percent consumed. So as you see near the bottom where we have lower production, those spots tend to be more of a light color, which means there's a greater percent being consumed rather than sold. We also wanted to look a little bit more at decision making with women and men in the household, and then also some of the SBC. So what we actually found was households with women participating in the decision, so either joint decision making or they were making the full decision about when to sell and how much to sell, that they're setting aside 18% less milk than households where the woman isn't engaged in the decision. So this is probably a little surprising on its face, but I think this may be explained by the fact that livestock rearing or dairy producing is an income generating activity for women. So men and women also keep their income separate. So when a woman all of a sudden has increased productivity and now has a revenue source that she didn't have before, she is now able to kind of cover and contribute more to the household than she may have been able to in the past. And then the next point is that households that reported receiving training on nutrition and were able to recall any sort of knowledge they had gained on nutrition were setting aside less milk for home consumption as well. So this, I think, raised some eyebrows for us and something we need to look into a little bit more. But this may be just because our SBC hasn't focused on the quantity of milk consumption, but has focused more on the frequency and the positive benefits. So what does this mean, right? I think a lot of times for ag to nutrition pathway kind of focused projects is we think when there is a commodity that's being produced that's not nutrient rich, say maize, we hope that the household is going to sell that and they're going along that income pathway and buying other nutrient rich foods. And then a lot of times I think for the production pathway, we think that when we're working with a nutrient rich commodity that it's going to go to consumption. But in the reality, it's a lot more dynamic than that. And these households, at the end of the day, are needing to cover some of their household expenses. So they are still considering these different consumption versus income, and probably are not considering as much, is this nutrient rich or is it not, like we oftentimes would. And I think there are also some important production versus consumption versus sale points that we have, especially with animal source foods, where, say for Bangladesh, producing 1 liter or 1.5 liters a day, that may be a point for consumption, but above that might be a point for sale. Whereas, say, for poultry producers in Burkina Faso, they might not hit that consumption point until they hit a flock size of 20, or they feel like they're able to then, that they are able to consume. So I think considering these different points in project design and pausing and reflecting sessions is quite pertinent. So what does this all mean, right? We saw the frequency of consumption increase, we saw productivity increase, but clearly we're still seeing the quantity as a challenge. So for us, the next steps is to run this analysis again. We're going to look at our 2018-2019 program data. So probably in September, October, I'll have some more information on this to see if we see the same patterns. And then I think we want to look into a little bit of the preference for sale versus consumption. So in July, we're actually going to be doing some focus groups discussions with some of these households to understand those patterns a bit more. And then lastly, I think this is important for a pause and reflect for CLA purposes for the project, right? It's an ongoing project, so for us this might be, we need to shift our SBC strategies and focus more on that quantity versus that frequency. Thank you.